Ever heard of a case where someone was found guilty even after, even after the person accusing them took back everything?
Oh, yeah. That's pretty wild.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a real head scratcher,
Yeah.
and it happened right here in the Philippines at the Supreme Court.
Interesting.
This case really gets you thinking about what immorality means.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about people working in the court system.
Oh, right.
So are you ready to dive into this legal maze?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I am fascinated by cases like this where, our usual ideas about how accusations work and then, someone changes their mind.
Right.
It really shows you how complicated things can be. The law isn't always black and white.
Yeah.
Sometimes it gets very messy.
It does.
Yeah.
So we're looking at A.M.? No. P-19-4020, decided back on November 28th, 2019.
Okay.
Elizabeth Gadong versus Josephine Butlig, who was a court stenographer.
A court stenographer. Okay, got it.
So to set the stage, Elizabeth, she accused Josephine of having an affair.
An affair.
With her husband, Leopoldo. Now, what made those initial accusations so strong?
Well, you see, when Elizabeth first came forward, she had this whole collection of evidence, and it seemed pretty damning at the time.
Yeah.
She had text messages that, they looked like they showed a pretty intimate relationship between the two of them. She talked about the suspicious van ride, and there was even this big dramatic confrontation in an apartment where she claimed she found Josephine and Leopoldo together.
So it sounds like at first, all signs pointed to an affair. What happened when the case landed in the lower courts?
So the first investigation was led by Executive Judge Harun B. Ismail.
Okay.
And their findings didn't completely back up Elizabeth's claims, you see. The judge actually suggested that Josephine might have been more of a victim in all this.
Okay.
Perhaps even manipulated by Leopoldo.
So there was some doubt about Josephine's role. Did they just leave it at that?
Not exactly. The Office of the Court Administrator, the OCA, they weren't quite satisfied with those initial findings.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
They saw these inconsistencies in what people were saying, and they pushed for a deeper investigation, to really look into certain parts of the case.
So they felt like something just wasn't adding up, and they called for a reinvestigation. What came out of that second look?
Well, this is where the case takes this totally unexpected turn.
Okay.
During that second investigation, Elizabeth, she completely recanted her initial accusations. She went from talking about a full-blown affair to, she started portraying herself as a jealous wife who totally misinterpreted the whole situation.
Wait, so she backtracked on everything?
Yeah, it was a pretty big change.
That is dramatic. What about her daughter and Leopoldo? They backed up her claims at first, right? Did they stick to their original stories?
Nope, they changed their stories too. Everyone got on board with Elizabeth's new version of events.
So the whole family backtracked and said there was no affair. Wow, you definitely don't see that every day in court.
Yeah.
So did the judges just accept that and drop the whole case against Josephine?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But that's where the Supreme Court stepped in. They basically said, hold on, not so fast.
Oh.
They really scrutinized those recantations and decided that some key details just didn't add up.
Okay. So the Supreme Court, they weren't convinced by this sudden, change of heart. What specifically made them doubt the recantations?
Well, there were a few things. First, they took a really close look at those text messages that Elizabeth had originally given as evidence. And they argued that what they said was, pretty explicit and couldn't just be explained away as some innocent misunderstanding between friends.
Yeah, that makes sense. If those messages really suggested a close relationship,
right,
it's hard to see how they could be misinterpreted. Were there other red flags for the court?
Yeah, Josephine's explanation for why she kept interacting with Leopoldo even after their legal case, which wasn't even related, was supposedly over. That was suspicious to the court. They found it odd that they would still be in contact if there wasn't something inappropriate going on.
So her connection with Leopoldo, even though she was claiming there was no affair, raised some big doubts. Anything else that made the Supreme Court skeptical?
Oh, yeah. Another strange thing was that Josephine never went to the police about Leopoldo when she said he stole her stuff.
Oh.
Even though she claimed he had harassed her before, her lack of action just didn't line up with the story she was telling.
It sounds like the court was putting together a puzzle.
Yeah.
And they found all these pieces that didn't fit in Josephine's story. So what happened in the end? Did they accept Elizabeth's recantation?
Well, they acknowledged that she had changed her mind, but ultimately they rejected it and went with her original accusations.
Wow. So even though Elizabeth took it all back,
right,
Josephine was still found guilty of immorality. How is that even possible?
Well, here's the really interesting part. The court's decision wasn't only based on what Elizabeth had initially claimed. They also looked very closely at what Leopoldo and Josephine themselves said.
Okay.
And surprisingly, their own words ended up supporting that initial accusation of an affair.
That's fascinating. So how did their own words come back to bite them?
When you dig into Leopoldo's statements, he actually admitted to having feelings for Josephine.
Really?
And Josephine, even though she denied the affair, she admitted that they kept interacting even after the legal case with Leopoldo was, supposedly settled.
So even though they were trying to deny it,
Yeah.
they basically admitted to it without realizing it. What happened to Josephine?
The Supreme Court, they suspended her for 6 months and 1 day without pay.
Wow.
And gave her a serious warning that any similar behavior in the future would lead to even stricter consequences.
So even though the person who made the accusations changed her mind, the court, they saw through all the inconsistencies and they found Josephine guilty, based on all the evidence, including her own words. This case shows how tricky these situations can be.
Yeah.
And how the court really considers everything before making a decision.
Yeah.
But what's even more interesting is the bigger picture here.
What's the context?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of unsettling to think that something you do in your personal life can have such a big impact on your job,
Right.
especially if you work for the courts.
It does make you think about where the line is between your personal life and your work life. But I think what the court's saying is that they see people who work for the courts as, like, representing the whole justice system. So their actions, even outside of work, can affect how people see the courts.
This case also brings up recantations.
Right.
Like when someone takes back what they said. Why do you think Elizabeth and her family decided to change their story completely?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It's hard to know for sure. Maybe Elizabeth really did change her mind. Maybe she realized she got it wrong or wanted to fix things with her husband. Or maybe there was pressure from, family or society that made them change their story.
Yeah, it reminds us that these cases aren't just about facts and evidence.
Right.
There are real people involved.
Exactly.
Like all their relationships and emotions. And that can affect how things happen.
Absolutely.
And even what people think is true.
Yeah, and in this case, the Supreme Court had to look at all those different perspectives, weigh the different stories, and make a decision based on what seemed most believable and consistent.
That sounds like a tough job, especially with the power dynamics involved.
Oh, for sure.
You have Elizabeth, the wife, accusing Josephine, a court employee, of having an affair with her husband. That power difference probably made things even more complicated.
Definitely power dynamics can really affect how people act and how others see them. The court had to think about all that when they were deciding who to believe.
Looking back at this whole case, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What's the main message here?
Well, I think this case shows us a few things. First, it shows us that finding the truth and holding people accountable can be really complicated, even when someone changes their story. The Supreme Court showed that they won't just accept someone changing their mind without looking at all the evidence to make a fair decision.
It also reminds us that actions have consequences.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in a position of public trust, like working for the courts.
Absolutely. Court employees are held to a high standard because they represent the justice system.
Yeah.
What they do, even off the job, can affect how people see the courts.
And maybe most importantly, this case reminds us that the legal system isn't always about finding a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
It's often messy and uncertain.
Yeah.
With different perspectives and emotions all mixed up in the search for justice.
Exactly.
Well said. Our deep dive into A.M. not. No, P-19-4020 has really shown us how complex the legal system is and how a case that seems simple can turn out to be much more complicated.
Yeah.
It reminds us that behind every case, there's a story.
Right.
And those stories teach us about truth, accountability, and just what it means to be human. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure. These legal puzzles are always so fascinating to explore.
This is The Deep Dive, and we'll be back with another thought-provoking case soon. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Leave a comment below if you have any thoughts on this case.
Yes, please do.
And let's keep the conversation going.